Did you know there are more people with genius IQs living in China than there are people of any kind living in the United States?
That can't possibly be true.
It is.
The math on that just doesn't make any sense. You're saying 1 in 4 people in China are geniuses. And he said it so matter-of-factly, too. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first Real VC Reacts videos. Cheesy name, I know. I am an analyst at RRE Ventures. It's one of New York's venture capital firms, so we invest in startups. I wanted to make this video series because I grew up loving Shark Tank and feel like you can actually learn a ton from just entertainment when it's business related. And so I wanted to go through some popular business movies and kind of figure out, okay, which situations are realistic, which aren't, and maybe translate some of the business terminology so folks who are interested in venture or startups could actually learn a thing or two.
Perfect timing. Eduardo's here, and he's going to have the key ingredient.
Give each girl a base rating of 14.
That's the key ingredient? That's the standard chess ELO formula. Come on, Mark.
We would need you to build a site, write the code, and we'll provide all the...
I'm in.
So this is really interesting because this is what's called a verbal agreement or a handshake agreement. And actually it's legally enforceable in court. Obviously it's just tricky to prove. So the takeaway here is you have to be really careful about what you say and make sure you write everything down. And even something written on a napkin can be legally enforceable. I actually heard an interesting story once. There was a founder who took his buddy out for a beer when he was first thinking about an idea for a business. And he told his friend about the idea, and then they didn't talk for months. Months later, he gets a letter. He's getting sued by the friend because that guy claims, oh, in the conversation, you told me I'd be a co-founder. And this guy had zero involvement up to that point. And they ended up having to settle in court. So I should say friend in quotation marks. So the idea here is to write down everything off the bat. Who's working for you? Who owns equity? Don't wait for a court to settle things later.
It means it's time for the website to start generating revenue.
The Facebook is cool, and if we start installing pop-ups for Mountain
Well, I
Dew, it's
wasn't
not going to be
thinking
cool.
Mountain Dew.
They are such good actors. Anyway, the initial tension in the movie between Eduardo and Mark is that Eduardo wants to commercialize sooner and start charging or putting out ads, and then Mark doesn't want to do that. And the question of who's right, because it's an important question. It's one that every founder is going to come across, and part of the reason why venture capital exists is sometimes to help put off that conversation with certain companies. But the question of who's right comes down to the type of business that you have. Because with some businesses, you want to monetize early, you want to show traction, you want to show that the unit economics work, and then you want to bring more capital in order to grow the business, or not. Sometimes you don't want to bring in more capital, right? But in this case, I think it's pretty clear that Mark is right. And that's because this is a business that benefits from what's called Metcalfe's law, or more simply, the network effect. And Robert Metcalfe was the founder of 3Com and the inventor of Ethernet. So he's like a tech legend. And he believed that the value of a network is equal to its number of users squared. So if there's 2 users on a network, square that number, that's 4. The value of the network is 4. If there's 3 users, square that number, 9. The value of the network is 9. So there's an exponential increase in the value as you add more folks to the network. And if you think about how that applies to Facebook, it makes sense. The way people stick to Facebook is they initially sign up, they see their friends, and they say, hey, that's cool. And then they stay on the platform because they're staying in touch with the folks that they know. And so the more folks they know, the more likely they are to stay on the platform, which then is a compounding effect. So in a nutshell, they're better off not doing anything that's going to endanger the growth and instead bringing some outside capital in potentially to finance the business activities. It's probably also worth mentioning that there is more than just the type of business that impacts whether or not you can raise capital, even without revenue. And one of those is the market environment. If you were raising in the late 90s, there was a huge tech boom happening. Everybody was getting financed. Probably would have been easy because they weren't even looking at metrics like revenue anymore. They were looking at some things like clicks per page or page views, right? And then after the tech crash, it was very difficult, even for great businesses, to get financing. Late 2021, you saw a lot of the mania, right? These markets go in cycles. Now, if you're watching this video in December of 2023, the market's kind of sour again. It's not as easy to raise pre-revenue.
Corporation papers for Facebook and LLC registered in Florida. Why Florida?
That's where my family lives.
Delaware has the easiest court system for businesses to navigate. It's pretty business friendly as a whole, and it doesn't actually charge taxes if you're not doing business in the state. So if you're starting a business, it's super highly recommended that you incorporate in Delaware. It's just very standard stuff. And it doesn't mean you have to be headquartered there. You can be headquartered anywhere.
Peter Thiel just made an angel investment of $500,000.
What?
It's kind of bad when your co-founder has no clue what's going on or who's investing until after the fact. But basically, Peter Thiel is a big heavyweight in Silicon Valley. He was a co-founder of PayPal, and then he wrote the first outside check into Facebook. Less than a year later, he founded Founders Fund, which is one of the most famous venture capital funds in California and in the world, really. And they're ironically kind of famous for never voting against a founder on a board, because a CEO of a company is not always the true boss of the company, right? Arguably the boss of the company is the shareholders, and if the CEO owns most of the company, then sure, they are the boss. But once you start bringing in outside investors, then there are other voices at the table, and that table is the board of directors, other shareholders, or folks that the shareholders vote to advance their interests. Oh, and I should probably explain, angel investing is kind of a pompous name, actually, for a practice where individuals, rather than funds, put money into a startup. And actually, angels can add a lot of value, especially early on, when a small check can translate to a larger equity piece in the company.
And so you got to get your ass on the first flight back to San Francisco. I need my CFO.
It's actually pretty unusual to have a CFO as one of the co-founders. And I think they're kids, right? So that kind of speaks to the inexperience that they call the head of sales or the head of business as the CFO. Typically, with a tech company, you have the CEO, and then you have like a CTO or chief technology officer. In this case, it was Dustin Moskowitz, one of the roommates of Zuckerberg. Probably the best title for Eduardo would be COO or chief operating officer, because CFO is really more of an accounting title, right? It's somebody who makes sure the books are correct, and works with the auditors and so on. And so at this stage of the business, probably really only needed like a fractional CFO today, or like there's a lot of services that sort of outsource that stuff until you've gotten a bit more scale.
And when you signed these documents, were you aware that you were signing your own death certificate?
No.
And it really was a death certificate. Eduardo basically signed away his voting rights. And so within that document, Zuckerberg and his lawyer had set up a trap. Mark proceeded to issue new shares and dilute Eduardo. So what does that mean? Imagine Mark had 20 shares, or actually let's say he had 15 shares in the company. Eduardo had another 5 shares. And then Mark issues another 20 shares. And because Mark is the majority shareholder, he can do that. And Eduardo has no voting rights, so he has no say over what happens here. Now there's 40 shares in the company. Mark, let's just say, assigns all those shares to himself, right? Now, Mark owns 35 shares. Eduardo still owns 5 shares. So Eduardo went from owning a large percentage of the company to a very small percentage.
How about now? You're still wired in? Full security. You issued 24 million new shares of stock.
Apparently, a couple of rounds of dilution happened before Eduardo even realized.
And what was your ownership share diluted down to?
0.03%.
Eduardo had originally owned a third of the company, and Mark owned the other 2/3.
I was your only friend. You had one friend.
Now, Eduardo and Mark were not actually friends in real life. I mean, they knew each other. They were a year apart in school, so they weren't roommates. Mark basically needed somebody to give some money for servers, and Eduardo came from a family that was very, very wealthy, and so that was the connection, basically. And Eduardo happened to be the head of the Harvard Investment Society, so to Mark, that signaled that maybe he knew a thing or two about business. The movie goes out of its way to portray Eduardo as a victim, but there were some faults on his end too in real life. Like, he advertised his own startup on Facebook for free without telling anyone. There were also allegations that he spent so much time partying in New York City that he didn't set up a proper business model like he said he would, and he didn't get financing for the business. If you're confused why that message mentions Brazilian thugs, it's because apparently Eduardo perpetuated a rumor that he was connected to the Brazilian mafia. Just college kid things.
Nod, you're gonna nod, and then you're gonna say, which one of you's Ross? You. Walk out.
So in this scene, Sean Parker is trying to get Mark to pull a prank on a venture capital fund. And so in the movie, they call it Case Equity, and they call the guy Ross. But in reality, that fund was Sequoia, which is pretty much top dog in the valley. They did investments into Apple, into Google, and a ton of other famous companies. And the partner is Michael Moritz, who was a leader there for many decades. Moritz was a journalist who ended up becoming a venture capitalist, and Sean Parker got an investment from his fund, Sequoia, for his company Plaxo back in the day. Then Moritz ended up helping to lead the vote to kick Sean Parker out of the company because he wasn't showing up to work, and when he did show up to work, he would bring groups of women to show off the office.
Walk in there and say you overslept and didn't have time to get dressed. They're gonna pitch you. Case Equity is going to pitch you.
And that really did happen. Mark showed up to Sequoia's office super late. He was dressed in pajamas and claimed he overslept, and then proceeded to give a presentation on a company that wasn't even Facebook. And his presentation was all about why not to invest in the company. I think it was called Warthog.
You better lawyer up, asshole, because I'm not coming back for 30%. I'm coming back for everything.
He got 5%. I mean, no one knows for sure, but that's what a lot of people think. And even that's worth tens of billions today, so you can't feel too bad for him.
I like sitting next to you, Sean. Makes me look so tough.
Such a sick burn. Although, in real life, unless you're Mike Tyson, you are going to flinch. Even if you're Mike Tyson, you're going to flinch if somebody's about to punch you.
How old are you?
21.
21?
21. I'm 21.
Lying only makes it worse.
Sean Parker really was arrested for felony possession of cocaine, though he was never officially charged. He was partying with his very young assistant at Facebook. At that point, one of Facebook's top investors at the time, a fund called Excel, a very famous fund, got nervous about his behavior and decided to kick him out of the company. So it's interesting. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme quite a bit. Now, if you're a romantic, I hate to break your heart, but that whole unrequited love story between Mark and Erica in the movie is all completely made up. He met his wife in real life in a line to the bathroom at a party that his friends threw him when they thought he was getting kicked out of Harvard. So he really just built Facebook to build Facebook. But that being said, it is really interesting to think about how far the company has come. Like at the end of the filming of the movie in 2010, the company was worth $25 billion and it had 500 million members. Now the company is worth $900 billion almost and has nearly 3 billion members. So that brings us to the end. Hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun. It was my first ever YouTube video, so apologies for the terrible editing that is to come. But it is 7:42 p.m. on a Friday in the office, so I will get out of here. I think next we might do Michael Scott Paper Company, so I'll see you then.